Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. If anybody has any free seats nearby, could you raise a hand and wave on those poor people who are sitting up on the ledge? This is a great turnout. We love to have problems like this, but I'm sorry we don't have enough seats for you. It looks to me like there are maybe 80, 90 people in the room, which is terrific. Welcome to the 2015 edition of Russia Now, the Current State of the Former Soviet Union. This is an annual panel discussion that we in Russian Area Studies here at Wellesley College launch, and it's our way of kicking off the academic year. My name is Tom Hodge. I teach in the Russian department at Wellesley College. I see some of my students here, but I also see lots of people from the community, lots of students that I haven't met before. Tonight we're going to have three speakers. I'll be the moderator, and I'll also give a few comments to begin with. Then we'll have Professor Nine Tumarkin from the History Department, and then Igor Logvinenko, our new faculty colleague over in the Political Science Department. And I will introduce those people properly in a moment. Each of us is going to take about 15 minutes to do our thing tonight. And after that, we'll take questions from the audience and see if we can get a little bit of a discussion going. So that's the basic overall shape. As we're waiting for the last people to kind of filter in, I thought I would just highlight a couple of upcoming events that we have associated with Russian Area Studies here at the college. The first one is coming up very soon, this next week, on Wednesday, September 16th at 4:30. It's going to be held in the Ruth Nagel Jones Theater over at Alumni Hall. This is going to be a very interesting presentation and discussion provided by Anatoly Smilyansky, who is an authority on Konstantin Stanislavski, author, famous theoretician of theater and of acting, and creator of the famous method. And Smilyansky will be delivering a lecture and sponsoring a discussion of Stanislavski's system. Again, that's on the 16th at 4:30 p.m. over in the Jones Theater. Then, and there's at least one other event that Professor Tumarkin is going to mention when she speaks. But I'd just like to highlight before that something that's coming up at the end of October, October 22nd at 8 p.m. right here in the library lecture room. There's going to be a lecture by Professor Valerie Sperling of Clark University. And she is going to be delivering a talk entitled Sex, Politics, and Putin, based on her book of the same name that has just recently come out, or is about to come out. Is it already? It's out, yeah. Okay. So my two colleagues, Nina Tumarkin and Igor Logvinenko, are sitting here, raring to go. I'd just like to say a few things about Professor Tumarkin. She is our fearless leader, sort of our vojdi uchitel, if you speak Russian. She is the director of the Russian Area Studies program, and she has organized this evening's festivities. A huge thank you to Nina for setting all this up, and also a huge thank you to our administrative assistants who did so much work to make this happen tonight. Professor Tumarkin is the author of two books, The Living and the Dead, The Rise and Fall of the Cult of World War II in Russia, and Lenin Lives, the Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia. And she is a longtime professor in the History Department, the backbone of our Russian Area Studies program. I'd like to take a little bit longer to introduce Igor Logvinenko. Igor is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. His research focuses on the nexus of globalization and political development in low and middle income countries. Specifically, he's interested in the consequences of financial globalization for authoritarianism, democratization, and capital flight, as well as issues of redistribution and state capacity. His regional interests lie in post-Soviet Eurasia, especially Russia and Central Asia, and China. Igor's current book project, entitled Open Economies, Closed Polities, Financial Globalization and Authoritarian Politics, develops a theory of financial openness under authoritarianism. This project offers a fresh look at authoritarian policymaking with useful implications for several literatures in comparative and international political economy. He has published articles in both Europe-Asia Studies, and the Moscow Times. And we are so happy to have a political scientist at long last who is also a Russianist. Just a few personal things about Igor. He is a native of Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. He attended the University of Redlands, a small liberal arts college in Southern California, where he graduated summa cum laude. Redlands is a rival of my own alma mater, Pomona College, but I like Igor nonetheless. He holds master's degrees at both Villanova and Cornell and completed his PhD in government at Cornell University this year. From 2012 to 2014, he was a residential advisor and tutor at the Wolpe Center for the Cornell and Washington, D.C. program. And prior to the start of his appointment here at Wellesley, Professor Logvinenko was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. Now, finally, two little-known facts about our new colleague. And the first one's embarrassing. Shamefully, Igor has a grade of B in water polo on his college transcript. That's the first one. So don't let that exterior fool you. And number two, as we learned at Academic Council, you faculty members may remember this on Wednesday, Igor once dabbled in stand-up comedy, so perhaps before the evening is out, he might provide a couple of one-liners. I don't know. Okay, so welcome, Igor. We're very glad you're here. What I'd like to do is offer a few comments about what happens when politics and the arts collide. They very frequently do collide in Russia. I mean, they do everywhere. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the current arts scene, mostly music, and the way Russian musical figures have gotten themselves into trouble in recent months and years. Is that a little better? And this will be copiously illustrated with photos of interesting Russians, I think. Let me see if I can advance my slide. Okay. All right, well, I'll stand over here, that's fine. Okay, before we can talk about or really grasp what's going on today with Russian artists and their interaction with the political scene, I think we need to take a quick look back at the Soviet period. Those of you north of 50 like me will remember that period well. And you will know, if you are a student or someone who's interested in, or a student of or someone who's interested in the Soviet Union, that the arts, including literature, music, dance, graphic arts, were always used in the Soviet Union for propaganda purposes. I mean, this has always been true. And that tendency was really expanded and moved beyond the borders of Russia, so that they weren't just used for domestic political purposes, but also for international propaganda purposes, as the Cold War really kicked into high gear. So as we look back at the Soviet period, you may remember that back in those days, the people who got out of Russia could generally be divided into two categories. It's obviously a lot more complicated than this, but I'm going to talk about this sort of simplified version. And those categories were dissidents and defectors. Dissidents are people very familiar to people who do my job. I'm a literary scholar, so I know very well people like Andrei Sinyavsky, who was finally allowed to emigrate to France in 1973, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was finally essentially deported from Russia in 1974, and the great cellist Mstislav Rostropovich, who was allowed to leave in 1974 and eventually ended up in the United States. These are household names. You probably all have heard of these people. It's no accident that two of the most prominent of these figures were literary men or literary figures. They were people who wrote for a living and wrote because it was the purpose of their lives. And that is because there wasn't a huge demand for Russian writers to go on tours abroad. There was no propaganda value to be derived from taking a Russian writer and allowing that writer to go all over the United States necessarily, or very little, compared to, say, musicians, dancers, opera singers. And so what tended to happen is that writers remained in the country. In the case of these particular writers, they were brutalized, arrested, and really had their lives turned inside out in just about every possible way before they finally got out of the country. Rostropovich was also denied the possibility of touring, even though he was a musician. That wasn't as usual for people in that field. Now, when we get to the defectors, again, those of you who were cognizant back during the Cold War, you might remember these people. And if you don't know them by sight, I put their names up here and the date of their defection to the West. These were people who basically opportunistically saw an opportunity to leave and move to the West quickly and get away from the Soviet authorities and start new lives in the West. Now, this was an opportunity that was available to them because they were touring all the time. Why? Because the Soviet authorities knew that artists like these, especially the dancers, were wonderful propaganda for the Soviet state. I mean, these were jaw-droppingly talented people. There's George Balanchine, a Georgian Russian who who fled to Paris in 1924, ultimately ended up in the United States. Rudolf Nureyev in 1961. Natalia Makarova, one of the great ballerinas of the 20th century. Mikhail Baryshnikov in 1974, one of the great male dancers of the 20th century. His, at least erstwhile friend, Alexander Godunov, who also 5 years later defected to the West. And then when he was on tour in Germany, Maxim Shostakovich, the son of the famous conductor Dmitry Shostakovich, also defected to the West. Now, once again, these are household names. And I remember as a kid, I didn't know much about Russia, but I sure remembered it seemed like almost every year you would read about some new earth-shatteringly excellent musician or dancer who had defected to the West. These are 6 really good examples of that. Not everyone defected who went on tour, of course. Maya Plisetskaya, who is pictured here, and she just died last May, by the way. Kind of hard to believe, but she amazingly actually stayed in the country. So she offers an example of someone who, for reasons that I still can never quite get my head around, stayed with Khrushchev's Russia at first and remained through various succeeding regimes. She was a Moscow-based artist. Many of those other defectors, the people who did leave, tended to be grouped around St. Petersburg. Or actually, sorry, I should say Leningrad back in those days. All right, so this is the background. We've got defectors, we've got dissidents. Now, let's take a look at what happens with performers and politics in the Putin period. A real kind of watershed moment recently in Russian cultural politics was created in March 2014 when an open letter was published that listed various artists, performers, writers who signed a letter supporting Putin's policy in Crimea and in Ukraine. So remember, Crimea has just been annexed, and the language of the letter is printed there for you. You can see what these people, what these signatories were actually supporting. And you can still go today and look up the website of the Ministry of Culture of Russia, of the Russian Federation, and you will see this document is still proudly displayed there. So there were 511 signers of this document. And I've plucked from that list 4 people who might be of interest to us. Yuri Bashmet, who's a violinist and violist and conductor, very famous person. Vladimir Spivakov, who is a violinist, not too long ago performed at Sanders Theater here at Harvard University. Oleg Tabakov, who is one of the most famous actors ever in Russia. And he's now the director of the Moscow Art Theater in Moscow. And then finally at the bottom, last but not least, Valery Gergiev, the great conductor. Now, not everyone who's pro-Putin signed that document. So there are some people who, even though they're Putin supporters, decided to remain unofficial supporters. One of the most prominent of them is Nikita Mikhalkov, very famous actor and now film director. I don't know what we should call him. Is he the Russian Spielberg? He's maybe to Russians that famous. He's not the same kind of filmmaker, but he is an absolute household name. And he's a strange, conservative, sort of neo-Slavophile person. He doesn't agree with Putin on everything, but he has been a staunch advocate most of the time. And then we have the really weird case of Gérard Depardieu, who is an actor, and as you can tell by his name, he's not Russian, he's French. And if you've been around for a while, you know about Depardieu. He's a superb French actor, at least back in the day. And he's sort of become a pseudo-Russian, a kind of honorary Russian, and has declared himself to be one of Putin's bosom buddies. And apparently they're quite close. And both of these men, just last week, actually, or a little less than 2 weeks ago, were put on a no-go list by the Ukrainian security service. So, there are about 15 people on the list, but these two in particular are the most famous. These two are not allowed to enter Ukraine, neither Mikhalkov nor Depardieu. All right. This next person, I don't know how many people who are up on classical piano performance these days have heard of this woman. Her name is Valentina Lisitsa. And please pardon the pretty vulgar photograph up there. I'll try to explain it, and then I'll take it down as quickly as I can. Lisitsa is quite a talented pianist who had been born in Ukraine, emigrated to the United States in the early 90s, had not much of a career going, was mostly a teacher of music. And then she somehow discovered how to use the internet to promote herself. And via YouTube, Twitter, various other, Facebook, social media, she managed to become a sensation. So if you Google her, or if you YouTube her, you will see that Lisitsa is all over the place. And now she performs to packed concert halls all over the world. So she also happens to be about as pro Moscow and about as anti-Kiev as you could possibly be. She, for example, posted on Twitter that image of pigs whose testicles have been painted in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And she has captioned it, or she has made a comment on it that says that if you want to know what the leaders of the Euromaidan look like, that's what they look like. So just sort of incredibly vulgar, hateful stuff. I mean, just, maybe beyond the pale. Well, what happened this last April is that she had booked a concert. She was going to perform Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. And there are enough Ukrainian Canadians who protested and let the leadership of the orchestra know about Lisitsa's various activities online, and the director of the orchestra decided to cancel her appearance based on the things she had been writing. And so this has created a bit of a tempest up north of the 49th parallel, and Lisitsa herself immediately responded with this image of herself, posting it on Facebook right after she was denied the opportunity to perform with the Toronto Symphony, claiming that she was being censored. And I leave it to you. Maybe we can talk about this. Should she have been dropped from the program or not? Or should she be allowed to say such things and post such things? And the pigs are just one example. I mean, there are other things that are equally bad. Now, much more typical is someone like Dmitry Khvorostovsky, a man from Siberia, who also happens to be one of the finest baritones who's alive on the planet at the moment. I don't know how many of you have heard him sing. If we had more time, I'd play some recordings by these people. But Chvorostovsky is also pro-Putin. He did not sign the open letter. And you can see his attitudes expressed there. And I would suggest to you that the way he phrases his support for Putin, or his view of Putin's Russia, is pretty typical of what I would say a sizable majority of Russians tend to think about what Putin has done with the country. So here, I would say Chvorostovsky's not really going out on a limb. It's a pretty common opinion. And yes, he really does look like that. Okay, now we get to the really big guns. This is Anna Netrebko. And she is, as I write up there, the soprano. She also, because she is so prominent and such a prominent representative of Russian culture, she has gotten herself into trouble politically. The first time she really got into hot water was perhaps no fault of her own, but she is an associate of Putin. She does support him. She is seen with him. She has accepted awards from him. And so when the anti-LGBT propaganda law, which is sort of a short label for what could be called something much longer, was passed by the Russian State Duma in, I believe, June of 2013, gay rights activists in the United States used Netrebko's upcoming performance of the title, well, not the title role, but the lead role of Tatiana in Tchaikovsky's Yevgeny Onegin at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City as an opportunity to launch some really serious, vociferous protests, saying that by appearing at the Met and not explicitly denouncing the anti-gay propaganda law that the Putin regime had seen through, she was complicit, and she herself was therefore homophobic and denying the rights of gay people. Now you can see that she sort of has a tepid response, you know, basically amounting to some of my best friends are gay and I'm really okay and I don't agree with everything, but you know, this was simply her first brush. All right. She got into more trouble last December, if I can, you move the pointer. When she had arranged after a performance in St. Petersburg to present a check to help support the Donetsk Opera House and Donetsk Opera Company in eastern Ukraine. This is part of the Russian-controlled section of Ukraine. And she wrote out a check, I forget for how many rubles, but it boiled down to something like $19,000. And she didn't realize it, but she was ambushed at the time, apparently, by photographers and by this man, whose name is Tsaryov. What's his first name? Yuri? I forget. Oleg Tsaryov, maybe. I think he's Oleg Tsaryov. And anyway, that's him right there. He is one of the leaders of the so-called Novorossiya state, which is this sort of self-proclaimed pro-Russian enclave, and he is the apparent, self-proclaimed Speaker of the Parliament. He unfurled a Novorossiya flag, which is hateful to any Ukrainian to see, and suddenly photographers appeared and started filming this. And so Netrebko, and you can see it in the video, there was video taken of it too, she's sort of taken aback and she kind of held it up. I'm not even sure she knew exactly what flag it was. On the other hand, it's possible that I'm whitewashing it a bit because it's hard for me to believe that my Anna Netrebko would do something like this. I do sort of worship her. So anyway, she had to issue that apology there that you see. All right. Oops. Well, the protest was quick in coming. The following month, in January of 2015, this man, whose name is Roman Targovitsky, and he is from Ukraine and has a PhD in biology from Harvard University, so he lives around here. He went down to New York City, jumped up on the stage after a performance, or at the end of a performance of Tchaikovsky's Iolanta, in which Netrебko was singing the lead role, in which Valery Gergiev was conducting. And he has a caricature of Putin on that poster that shows Putin with an Adolf Hitler mustache. And the kind of amazing thing is that, a few amazing things. I mean, as you can see, Netrебko is smiling there. She sort of held her composure throughout the whole thing, and later interviews she said she was quite upset. But the second really strange thing is that this is not the first time that Mr. Targovitsky, who's a pro-Ukrainian activist, had done something like this. He had, at that concert by Vladimir Spivakov, who signed the letter, at Harvard, at Sanders Theater, he had jumped up and disrupted the performance while it was going on and had to be hauled away, this was in September of 2014, by the Cambridge police. And the weirdest thing of all is that the performance art and political activist group called Pussy Riot, you've probably heard of these folks, the ones who had the infamous anti-Putin demonstration inside the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, I think in February of 2012, if I'm not mistaken, and had been imprisoned for it. Pussy Riot members happened to be in Cambridge because they were attending a conference at Harvard. And Pussy Riot went to the Cambridge police and petitioned for Mr. Targovitsky's release the next day after he had disrupted the concert at Sanders Theater, and he was released. All right. This is Valery Gergiev, a pro-Putin artist who did sign and who is probably Putin's most important propaganda tool in the world of the arts. This is Valery Gergiev, a brilliant conductor who has the credentials that I have up on the screen there for you to look at. He is someone who is, in what he has done for Russian music in the last 2 decades, is absolutely admirable. I mean, he has taken the Russian repertoire and placed it firmly in the middle of the modern Western musical world. And I have enormous respect for his talent and what he's done in that regard. Unfortunately, he has politically been a pretty unprincipled person, and done whatever Putin has asked him to do pretty much every time Putin asks him to do it. I have a lot more actually in this slideshow, but I'm realizing that I'm using up my time, so I'm gonna, I think, wrap it up there. But as I do, I'm simply gonna show you a couple slides that demonstrate to you that anti-Putin artists do exist. So there's the writer Boris Akunin, and we've got some rock and roll musicians who are not as beholden to the state in order to be able to perform their art. So they tend to be a little bit more politically independent. So Gribenshikov and Zemfira and Yuri Shevchuk of DDT, these are all very important rock musicians. And down here we've got another famous film director, a guy named Andrei Mikhalkov-Konchalovsky, who happens to be the brother of Nikita Mikhalkov. And Mikhalkov-Konchalovsky, this brother, signed a counter letter denouncing those artists who are supporting Putin's policies in Ukraine and Crimea. But they did come together on a recent campaign to see what they could do to end the reign of McDonald's fast food in Russia. I'm not making this up. So it splits families, but fast food brings families together. Okay, thanks. I'll stop there and yield the floor to Nina Tumarkin. Thank you, guys.
I'd like to talk about something that is a different kind of cultural politics, the politics of political culture in Russia today. This is a very dramatic period in Russia's history. There are many people who are truly suffering in Russia right now. There have been recent articles that point out that almost a seventh of the Russian population is now living below the poverty line. This just came out a few days ago. I will explain what this is. It's a lot of people walking, as you can see, and I'll be talking about it. In the first months of 2015, the number of Russians living on less than the minimum income grew to almost 22 million people. It's an almost 15% increase from last year. This is very significant, and there have been soaring inflation that has caused wages to fall. Some state sectors of the economy have seen major pay cuts. The ruble is very weak. I'm sure you've read about that. I myself was shocked to see that. I just checked today. There's about 67 rubles to the dollar. And just last year, it was about 35 rubles to the dollar. Of course, oil prices are very low. People say that the sanctions have had, the sanctions by the Western countries have had an effect, and that's probably true as well. And yet, Vladimir Putin's ratings continue to be very high. They are declining, but they're declining from a high of 89% approval ratings in June of 2015. Now they're down to 82%. Can you imagine any American president ever having approval ratings like that? And then you wonder, with the economy being what it is, how do you explain those approval ratings? What is important to Russians? What values do Russians adhere to? In what way is the state actually mobilizing popular support for Putin, popular support for itself? If we go back to a year ago and the Russia Now panel, a year ago, 2014 was a year of great national jubilation. It began with the Sochi Olympics in February, which everybody considered enormously successful, despite the $51 billion price tag. And then getting back to Tom Hodge's cultural politics, there was a massive celebration of Russian culture in the opening ceremony. Ballet, music, literature, all these great names of the great literary and cultural figures were touted at that time. And it was considered a great success, and the Russian medalists, the Russian athletes fared very well also. And then very popular came the very next month, in March, the annexation of Crimea, the referendum, and then the breathtaking annexation of Crimea that none of us had expected in the wake of all the events in Kiev. This was an event that was extremely popular in Russia. And the big slogan was Krym nash, Crimea is ours. A ribbon that many people used to wear in Russia, actually sometimes in the Soviet period, on Victory Day, a black and orange striped ribbon, which some of my students thought meant that there was a support for Princeton University. It actually wasn't. It was the so-called Georgian ribbon for military valor that dates back really to the time of Catherine the Great in the 18th century. That had been really specifically worn to celebrate the victory in World War II, and suddenly it became just a symbol of patriotism. If you were pro-Russian, if you were glad about the annexation of Crimea, you wore that ribbon, and people throughout Russia were wearing these ribbons, a tremendous amount. And we saw also in 14 and coming into 15 a very rapid Russification of Crimea. It was extraordinary. I mean, it was very important immediately already last fall to start the Russian curriculum in the schools and to have university places for Crimea, to really turn it into a Russian territory, really annex it thoroughly. This, again, was very, very popular in Russia by most people, as far as most people were concerned. It was popular to some Crimeans, not to all of them. And a dramatic moment came, and here I guess I have to use this thing. A dramatic moment came when a monument, this is background pics, this is unnamed, this is this. No, this is this. No, you don't want to see that. That's really bad. It's really bad. This is really bad. And here's a more dramatic one. Actually, if I do the green thing, this is kind of getting me ahead. Just something that's a very ugly aspect of the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the victory. And I may as well just, I don't have to explain what you're seeing. It really gets to be very ugly. The words say 1941 to 1945, we can repeat, we can do it again. We can do it again. And so what the communists did to the Nazis, we can do again, and we can do it, I guess I have to do escape here. We can do it to, yeah. So that's the Russian flag, obviously. And so there's a lot of ugly stuff that's come out, and I wanted to say something in a little while about the Victory Day commemoration, which was an extremely dramatic and important event. Let's see if I can just get out of here. I can get, yeah. But a dramatic event occurred in Crimea in February when a monument was unveiled to the Big Three. This happened in the city of Yalta. The Yalta Conference was the 70th anniversary of the Yalta Conference. So you have Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and some little kids dressed like sailors. Roosevelt looks very handsome in that. And then these Russian flag-colored balloons were let loose. No, we don't need this. And actually, can I just, how do I just get out of all of this stuff? All right, okay, I just get all of it. Get out of all of it for the moment. So there was a big furor about this. There had been a lot of people protesting because this was going to be a monument to Stalin, effectively, a monument to Stalin. They said, no, it's the Big Three. But the monument was unveiled, and in Crimea, there lives a significant minority population of Crimean Tatars. And these Tatars, Crimean Tatars, many of them, their ancestors, their grandparents, were deported en masse in 1944 away from Crimea and to Central Asia, at the same time that the Chechen population from Chechnya were also deported because some of their members were charged with collaborating with the enemy. And that was really a very bitter and terrible deportation. And so you have this sort of intrusion of Stalin. This year was a very big event, the 70th anniversary then of not, of course, just the Yalta Conference, but of the end of World War II, the victory over the Germans. And I actually asked everybody to have at their seats a little flyer. I'm really kind of jumping my Russian area studies capacities and saying a word here as a professor in the history department. We're going to have a history department panel that's on September 30th at lunchtime. Lunch will be provided here in this very room, in which my colleagues and I are going to talk about how the end of World War II has been remembered 70 years later in Russia, in Germany, in Japan, and the United States. But I'd like to say something about that holiday here tonight, because it was such an important event for Russia this year. The campaigns for it began very early. There was a Kremlin website that was May9th.ru. And you can take a look at it yourselves if you like. May 9th is the date of victory, of the Victory Day celebration. And in the West, in our newspapers, the whole big question was, who is going to go to Putin's party? That is to say, which Western leaders are going to attend the military parade in Moscow? There has been a real history of controversy over the presence of Western leaders, particularly American leaders, at these events. It's important to note that in contradistinction to the 400,000 people who died in World War II, who were United States citizens, over 27 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II. You can't begin to compare these kinds of numbers, and you can't begin to compare the different valence that the victory holiday has in that country and in our country. The panelists we were just talking about at dinner that we just had in our own country, September 2nd, in theory, was the 70th anniversary of VJ Day, the end of the war and the victory over the Japanese in ending World War II. And there wasn't even a little op-ed piece in the New York Times. I mean, there was nothing. It was completely ignored. The president made a speech. There was a press release, and that was it. So we're historical amnesiacs, but for us it was a very different and complicated story, and I hope the history department panelists will talk about this at our upcoming panel on September 30th. But in Russia, this was an enormous event. In 1984, President Reagan outraged people in the Soviet Union by going to Europe for the 40th anniversary of D-Day and visiting a cemetery, a German cemetery at Bitburg, Germany, where he visited actually some graves of SS officers. And the Soviets were outraged. He had wanted to actually visit a concentration camp, but German Chancellor Helmut Kohl said, no, you should visit this cemetery, and we agreed. So the Soviets were outraged. And the next decade, the big 50th anniversary commemoration in 1995, President Clinton went to Moscow. He said he was not going to be willing to witness a military parade, so the military parade was moved out of Red Square to somewhere else, and he witnessed the ceremonies in Red Square, marches of veterans and soldiers. George Bush came for the 60th in 2005, and actually did witness the military parade. It was a very different mood, and then in 2010, it was really quite extraordinary that for the first time, for the 65th anniversary, there were Western troops from the United States, from France and from Britain, who were marching in the victory parade in Red Square. And beginning with the 60th, around Red Square, people started handing out free CDs of World War II music, World War II songs, and that was very astonishing in Russia, because usually they don't give you anything. You always have to buy things. Although this year, there were many people giving out those ribbons. I came home with about 5 of them. I was in Moscow in May for the Victory Day commemoration myself. But in 2010, you had these troops, and the CD that was given out, it was very interesting for the 65th anniversary. The first song was sung by children, and it said, I don't like war, we'll never have war is terrible. And it was in a way harking back to the Soviet war cult of World War II, which some of you, the older people in the audience, might even remember, which was hyperbolic, which was involved in orgy of self-congratulation. It did all those things, but it also commemorated the millions and millions of war dead, and it theoretically set itself up as a complex of rituals that was meant to send the message that war is unthinkable. The Soviets set themselves up as guardians of the peace. We have suffered so much from this war, we will be the guardians of the peace. The Japanese did something like that as well. We suffered this, atomic bombing, and we are the guardians of the peace. And so that was the moral lesson from the Soviet cult of the war. When I got to Moscow this past May, there was a very different mood. And the major lesson was, we won in 1945, we can do it again, which is a very different kind of moral lesson. Most of all, first it had been against Ukraine. And there were a lot of tensions with Ukraine from the get-go. All kinds of language on both sides. Both sides were accusing each other of being Nazis, of being fascists. This World War II language was extremely strong and insulting. And so it was very dramatic that there was the sense that Russians felt that the Ukrainians and the Eastern Europeans are trying to steal their victory. The Polish foreign minister came out with a statement which really enraged the Russians. At the end of January, when there was the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the Polish foreign minister said that the Ukrainians had liberated Auschwitz. Well, in fact, that hadn't been the case. It had been a part of the Red Army, which was called the Ukrainian Division, because they had fought in Ukraine. But all of these arguments were going back and forth about the importance of Russia, though the importance of whose victory is it. And when I got to Moscow, a couple of days before the victory on May 7th, and before the actual victory commemoration, and there was an enormous amount of hardware. There had been a lot of talk about who's going to attend the event. As you probably know, President Obama did not go. And in fact, the only European head of state in all of Europe who went was the president of Serbia. Serbia is very close to Russia. The president of China was there. The president of India was there. And so Putin's Victory Day speech came off as very strange when he was talking about the great contribution of India to the defeat of the enemy in World War II, and the West talked a lot about the military parade, and they showed the military parade. But I know that many people in Russia were very upset because the main event was the event that I showed you at some point here. Where I forget it. I was showing you lots of people marching, and and that was really here. I don't know why it's in black and white, but this was a really extraordinary event that was hardly covered in the Western press at all. It was called the Immortal Regiment. And in Moscow alone, between 300,000 and 400,000 people marched through the streets. As you see, they're carrying portraits. It's just the way they used to have these religious processions carrying icons. And somebody got the idea, actually, in a Russian city 3 years ago, that the veterans are almost all dead. and that people can actually walk with portraits of their loved ones who had fought in the war. And so all of these people had their portraits, the portraits of their loved ones, put up on those kind of little placards that they're holding, and came out in force, and not just in Moscow, in many cities, in St. Petersburg, in many cities. And it looked at the beginning like it was a spontaneous outpouring of popular attempts to really just pay the respects to their own family members. And then Putin joined the group and started march, and he also marched with a portrait of his father, who had been in the Navy during World War II. And then all kinds of things started, kind of delegitimized it when it was talked about. If you think about who got all those photographs up on those placards, and that the state was manipulating it and so on. But it was nonetheless a very, very important event. Angela Merkel, the president of Germany, did come to Moscow, but the next day. She wouldn't go to the military parade, but she came the next day, and she laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And that was really very important. And actually, the German foreign minister went to Volgograd, which is Stalingrad. So there was some European presence. But in general in Russia, there was a feeling on the one hand that the celebration that had convulsed the nation was really not a celebration of the war, a commemoration of the war. It was now the cult of the war had been transformed into a cult of the victory. And it was the victory itself that was being celebrated. And there were so many museum exhibits. I went to many of them, and they were all called victory. They weren't called war. And so it was a very different feel. It was a very striking place. I went to an exhibit that had portraits of Roosevelt, of Stalin, and of Churchill, and then right next to them a huge portrait of Putin. Who's like the next leader, who's taking all the credit. So it was really an extraordinary time. And I interviewed lots of people who were on this march, and I asked them what the victory meant to them. And they said pride in what their nation had done, pride in what their army had done. But then the big question is, is there anything else that Russians could feel proud of? It's a time when patriotism is very high, and in Russia, it's actually illegal to have an official ideology. So the Kremlin has turned not to ideology but to history, to celebrate various events in history. I talked to somebody who was really very much a dissident at the Memorial organization, which is dedicated to the doing research on the victims of Stalinism. And she said, why can't Russia take pride in the fact that 25 years ago, the Soviet Union ended without any bloodshed, as opposed to what happened in Yugoslavia? Why can't that be a source of pride? Why does military victory have to be the most important source of pride? And anniversaries become extremely important in celebrating historical events, and historical events are very important even to Putin himself. He just made a speech a couple of days ago, actually last week. He was at a particular place, he was in Sochi, where the Olympics had been, and a huge gathering of young people. It was a kind of a conference on sports, science, and the arts. And he said that young Russians should work for the glory of their country. And they should remember about all of the great people in Russian history who have worked so hard. They should be like Peter the Great. I mean, when is Obama going to tell people they should be like Alexander Hamilton? You know, I mean, the very idea that 18th century figures should be used to kind of rouse young people to action, that really does happen in Russia. And now the big controversy over history has taken place over the major anniversary that Russia just commemorated and Ukraine just commemorated, which was the millennium of the death of Prince Vladimir. Prince Vladimir of Kiev, as you can imagine, if he died 1,000 years ago, he was born even longer ago than that. And he reigned in Kiev as the most important prince of the Kievan Empire, which is really a very ancient empire that was connected with Byzantium. And he was the one who brought Christianity to Russia. He was baptized, of course, in Crimea. Everything happened in Crimea. He was baptized in Crimea and then went back to Kiev and brought Christianity. And there is an enormous monument to him in the city of Kiev, but that's Ukraine. And so now for the millennium, Moscow decided it has to have a monument to Vladimir also. And there was a big controversy about where it's going to go. Finally, it's been decided it's going to go up in central Moscow, and it's going to be even taller than the one in Kiev. And so it'll be very interesting to see. I hope you will watch how the next big anniversaries are going to be commemorated. 2016, the 25th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union. 2017, the centennial of the Russian Revolution. 2018, the end of the centennial of the end of World War I and the beginning of the Russian Civil War. So I hope you'll be watching the historical politics of the Kremlin, because in Russia, history really matters. It does at Wellesley too, by the way. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. In my role today, I'm to give you kind of a whirlwind tour of Russia's place in the international system, and also briefly talk about Russian economy. I really want to thank the Russian Area Studies for welcoming me so kindly, and I really appreciate it, and also the Wellesley community more broadly. So let me begin quickly. So I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to mention Ukraine, Syria, and China. So Sino-Russian relations, and talk about the economy a little bit. So let me just begin with Ukraine. My goal here is to just kind of bring you up to date, give you some updates of what's been going on or what's happening now in those three arenas of Russian foreign policy, and then we can kind of go to quickly, hopefully go to Q&A. So Professor Tumarkin filled you in a little bit on the Ukrainian situation and over the past couple of years, but to give you a quick background, so a series of protests started in December of 2013 that resulted in tremendous violence. Viktor Yanukovych, the previous president of Ukraine, fled Kiev in February of 2014, and in March of 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. And eastern Ukraine subsequently was set aflame the following summer. There was the downing of the Malaysian airliner, presumably by the pro-Russian separatists, although that still hasn't been fully settled. By the end of last summer, the Europeans finally get on board to introduce really meaningful sanctions against Russia. During the past winter, Ukrainian troops suffered significant setbacks in Donbass. And in February of this year, Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France agreed on a ceasefire. There's subsequently been multiple ceasefires. The latest one seems to be holding more or less. And to date, we have about 6,500 dead in the conflict, and a host of ongoing issues at the moment. Most pressing currently in the fall and as we go into the winter is that there isn't an agreement signed for gas deliveries to Ukraine as of yet. Now, what I'd like to argue, if there's an overarching argument to my remarks today, is to say that this fall seems like an interesting opportunity for a settlement in eastern Ukraine. There's a confluence of events that are pointing in that direction, and actually on all fronts that I'm going to mention, on the Syria, China, Ukraine, and even in domestic Russian economy, all of the factors seem to be lining up for a potential settlement. And the question is Washington ready, willing, and willing to go ahead with it? So most recently, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law, or a first reading of the law, that would grant significant autonomy to the Lugansk and Donetsk regions of eastern Ukraine. These are first very initial steps, but they go along with the general broad outlines of the Minsk settlement of earlier this year. In the aftermath, on August 31st, Kiev saw the worst violence on its streets since the Euromaidan revolution. 3 National Guardsmen were killed and over 100 others were injured in an apparent attack by an individual from a nationalist Svoboda party who threw a grenade into a crowd of policemen. So the end game in Ukraine, it seems to me, is will have to include a kind of a future autonomy for Lugansk and Donetsk, with some measure of control over, where these two regions have some measure of influence, or if not veto, over potential military alliances of Ukraine, including the one with NATO. The question that will immediately follow that resolution of that problem is the control over borders with Russia in those two regions. I would imagine Russian military is continuously building up military capacity on the Russian side of the border, and it seems unlikely to me that the current leadership of Lugansk and Donetsk would agree to any kind of control of the border to the central government in Kiev. Now, this sort of good news over the last few days, as there's been an apparent coup in the Donetsk People's Republic, and the more moderate individual was installed to lead this breakaway republic, and so it's looking like both in Kiev there's some movements towards concessions to the breakaway republics, and it seems to be like a more moderate forces are getting ready to perhaps move towards some kind of a more or less semi-permanent settlement. But again, this is all very tenuous and uncertain. Let me briefly also mention Belarus. Belarus is having elections this year in October 11th. Usually these are sort of staged facade elections they're not widely contested. However, a Russian government has been recently pressuring to put a new air base in Belarus, which Lukashenko, the president of Ukraine, of Belarus, has been rejecting, and so the Russian military actually had, practiced these maneuvers where they put down a color revolution in the neighboring country. So I've heard some rumors about this idea of kind of a provocation in Minsk that would lead to an involvement of the Russian military to put in a friendlier vassal in Belarus. So that's something to watch for in the very nearest future. I have a young heckler. It's all right. I'm okay with it. So let's move on quickly on to Syria. Syria is a really fascinating situation. It's developing as we speak in terms of the Russian involvement. So the Russian position on Syria has actually been quite consistent ever since the beginning of the conflict 4 or 5 years ago. Putin has been critical of American adventurism in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. He put the responsibility on the rise of ISIS directly at the hands of the American administrations over the last 15 years. And he's been a staunch opponent of all radical Islamist movements in the region. So this week we've learned that Russia deployed troops to Syria, and in fact we had a confirmation over the last couple of days that these troops have participated in active combat in Syria. And the New York Times just reported that Russia is building prefab housing for about 1,000 troops in Syria. This is a completely new development, and Russian troops haven't participated in direct combat outside of what they perniciously called the near abroad since the breakup of the Soviet Union. The largest buildup is happening in Latakia, which is the ancestral homeland of the Assad family, and Russia is also exploring the idea of building a new airfield there. Now, what's notable is that the troops that are being deployed in Syria are the same troops that participated in this quiet takeover of Crimea. If you remember the little green man, that's the 810th Marine Brigade from Crimea. Putin also just issued a surprise military drill of the Central Military District, putting on alert 95,000 troops. And he did the similar maneuver right before the annexation of Crimea. So it seems to be a similar playbook in the sense that you establish sort of facts on the ground, and then you negotiate from a stronger position. And this is the tack that Putin has taken in the past. And so my understanding of the kind of attitude towards American foreign policy in Syria over the last 4 or 5 years, both in Europe, but also in sort of authoritarian, anti-Islamist Middle East, and certainly in Russia, is that American foreign policy in Syria has been a catastrophic failure. And especially with this migrant refugee crisis, European leadership is becoming more and more open to the idea of some kind of a settlement in Syria that might not even involve the departure of Assad. So Francois Hollande recently mentioned that he would be open to the possibility of removing sanctions, which have been in place vis-a-vis Russia. And he notably did not mention any kind of settlement around the Crimean issue. So Crimean issue seems to be off the table, at least as far as the Europeans are concerned. So again, I think it's another part of the picture where we can say that some potential opportunity for a settlement with Russia is possible this fall. The refugee crisis in Syria, Russian troops, refugee crisis in Europe, Russian troops in Syria, and the kind of impotent American foreign policy, and Europeans who are kind of upset at the lack of American engagement there. Another part of the puzzle here is the China piece. So in May of 2014, Russia and China signed this huge deal worth of about $400 billion to supply 38 billion cubic meters of gas through a new pipeline which called Power of Siberia, and that this pipeline would be the largest in the world. And shortly after, at the end of last year, there was an agreement to build another pipeline worth $300 billion. Subsequently, it's been put on hold because of the economic downturn in China. But the size of these developments was really tremendous. Putin's policy ever since this real, kind of breakaway or a real breakdown of the relationship with the West has been to diversify consumers of Russian energy and to move towards the East. And so according to these plans, it's not clear to me that they'll eventually be fulfilled, but China by the year 2020 would have been dependent on Russia for 17% of its gas, which is an enormous amount. So we'll see how it turns out. But of course, this Power Siberia 2 project that will take the pipeline through Altai needs a lot of financing. It's a really very heavily. It's a very demanding project in terms of this, in terms of the infrastructure required, and the Russian businesses are currently cut off from Western financing because of the sanctions. So they have to go for the money to the Chinese, and the Chinese economy went into spiral in August, and so a lot of this is kind of on hold. Putin visited Beijing for the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the end of the World War II, and there was a number of agreements. They always tout these agreements. There was 20 agreements were signed, as if the number of agreements really matters. Well, what's important is what agreements weren't settled. One among them is that Novatek, which is the largest independent natural gas producer in Russia, led by one of Putin's buddies, Gennady Timchenko, wasn't able to reach a financing agreement for an LNG project in Yamal because of the lower prices of energy and new deliveries from Australia in particular. The Chinese just don't need as much energy anymore. And so a couple of important pieces of development this year is that, does anybody know, for example, who is the largest source of imports of corn into China? It's Ukraine. Just this year, it's Ukraine. China has developed a very close economic partnership with Ukraine over the last couple of years. They've also developed a close investment partnership with Georgia in their tourist infrastructure. And so you might imagine that the idea of China getting closely aligned economically with either Ukraine or Georgia could not possibly make Kremlin very happy. So it seems to me that the differences between the interests of China and Russia and Central Asia continue to manifest themselves. So whatever news of a Russo-Chinese detente you might hear, I think any kind of cooperation between the two is built on rather fragile foundations. In terms of turning now to the Russian economy, situation in Ukraine, kind of opening up some opportunities for settlement. Putin putting troops in Syria, hoping to bargain for sort of Syria for Ukraine kind of situation. Then we have the Chinese who've kind of turned off the money spigot for Russia. So, and then the most devastating piece of news perhaps for Russians is the state of the Russian economy. Now, Russian economy has been slowing down considerably since about 2011. There was a huge dip during the recession, and then it grew at about 4% in 2011. This year, it's expected to contract by about 3.4%. So Russia is effectively in the recession as we speak. In terms of overall reversing of fortunes from 2011 to 2014, Russia has been the worst performing economy as compared to all of Europe, China, Middle East, average of the world, Brazil. It's been performing the worst. So both lower oil prices and Western sanctions are to blame. The best IMF estimates suggest that sanctions have chipped about 1.5% of the Russian GDP, which, depending on how you count, is about $200 billion. So in that sense, they've been quite effective. Russia, as most of you probably know, is very dependent on oil and gas exports. About 2/3 of all Russian exports are oil and gas. So if the prices of energy go down, Russia becomes very vulnerable. By contrast, 60% of U.S. exports, the category, 122 items make up 60% of all U.S. exports. And the largest single category is aircraft, civilian aircraft, engine equipments and parts, and it comprises only 6.6%. So there would be this huge it's very difficult to harm the United States in terms of the global kind of volatility of prices for particular commodities, parts, or exports. So a Russian budget, on the other hand, depends for at least, Putin claims that it's 50% of oil and gas revenue, which tells you that it's the most conservative or most optimistic, rather, estimate. Some other people suggest something on the order of 80%. Gazprom revenues will likely drop by 1/3 this year to about 106 billion. Gazprom, which is the Russian national gas monopoly, it alone generates 10% of Russian GDP, 20% of budget revenues. With energy prices being at about 40 to 50% lower than they were 4 or 5 years ago, Russia effectively will have to make up for 25% of tax revenues, which obviously creates some dire straits ahead indeed. A recent report by the Higher School of Economics suggests that about half of Russia's 83 regions are effectively bankrupt. Russian companies have to refinance about $100 billion worth of foreign-denominated debt until the end of the year. Russian oil producers are tremendously dependent on Western technology, which tends to wear out fairly quickly. So the replacement cycle for oil and gas equipment is rather short. So without Western drilling equipment and foreign financing, Russia's infrastructure is likely to decay very quickly, and they won't be able to, put out as much oil as they have, which has been until recently the highest has been since the end of the since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They even outpaced the Saudis for a stretch of a few months there some years ago. Now, you could say this sounds really, really terrible. I mean, to me, that sounds really, really bad, and that something, if I was Putin and I was looking at these numbers, I would probably be trying to look for ways to resolve some of the issues with the West, so that they can get some of the foreign financing for a lot of these projects. But you also have to give, and I studied Russian political economy for a few years now, and I still can't quite explain this kind of prudential, very conservative management of the Russian budget that, for the most part, outside of the expansion of social benefits, the official reserves are down from $500 billion to about 340 billion. I would say the counterfactual could be much, much worse, that the government has still significant room for some kind of stimulus program. Growth, it looks like, should be returning at about 1% in 2016, according to the IMF estimates. And so it seems to me that the Russian economy is doing much better than it should be, given the circumstances. But it seems to me that both the picture on the kind of dire situation in the Russian economy, this new developments in Ukraine, the Syrian adventure, and the kind of drop-off of the Chinese alternative to the West suggest an opportunity for a settlement. And so, for the first time in 10 years, this is your great opportunity to go to New York and see Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who is coming to the UN General Assembly at the end of September, who will be chasing Barack Obama down the halls to try to meet with him on the sidelines. So it should be a fun show at the end of the month. And thanks very much. And I think we're turn to questions. Yeah. All right.
Okay, thanks very much, Igor. And thank you, audience, including the little heckler. All right, so now, are these mics working or even necessary? Now we can take a few minutes for questions and answers. And I'll act as moderator, and you can address your questions to any of us, and we'd be glad to take those questions. So, sir, go ahead.
Would anyone like to comment on the situation in the Kaliningrad Oblast? We had a corridor similar to the one between the two world wars, the Polish corridor, which was that situation that seems to be affecting the Baltics and Poland and Russian policy towards them.
Yeah.
And there seems to be evidence that's getting explosive there because the inhabitants there are very unhappy.
Yeah. I confess I don't know a lot about what's going on in Kaliningrad. Other panelists?
Do you want this?
Yeah.
I think, see if it's
No
on.
one seems to be covering this. Speaking
Is
of
this-
that as a history.
Yeah. So I'm certainly no specialist on the Kaliningrad Oblast, but to those of you who don't know, there's a kind of an enclave within Europe outside of the Russia's borders that is Russian territory. And my sense is, at least on one part of it that I can comment on, is that the Russian government has been doing its best over the last 10 years to populate the Kaliningrad Oblast with emigres from the former Soviet Union, the so-called Russians in the near abroad, and they've been quite successful in doing so. So the population has increased, but I think there's a kind of a issue of comparing your livelihood to the neighboring countries, and also lack of access to, the motherland, so to speak. So there've been issues about train tickets and the price for those train tickets and whether they'll be subsidized, and the issue with the Schengen visas and how these people can travel immediately outside, but the border control. But it hasn't come up. On my recent memory, I haven't seen it be sort of part of any kind of major conversation. But certainly there's possibility of all kinds of military potential adventurism within Kaliningrad. But I haven't seen it be mentioned in
Sort
any.
of a backward oblast, which they subsidize.
I'm not too sure what's going on, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was, a couple of days ago, there was actually a huge military parade in China to which Putin was actually invited as a special guest. I think in a certain duration of the program, he was seated right next to Xi. And then I just became fascinated how Xi was also apparently invited to the parade in Moscow, and for that matter. And regarding this matter, I actually have two questions. One is culturally and historically, why do you think is there a drastic division between China and Russia and the West? Because apparently in West there is no such big celebration regarding the historical event, but in China and Russia that was apparently just a military show-off to the rest of the world. And then another one is that, do you think this is suggestive of potentially a military agenda, like a military collaboration or of some sort between China and Russia in the future? Yeah.
Well, can I answer it first, and then you? This is for the Soviet Union. This period of the Soviet Union, beginning for many, many years ago. Victory Day was always celebrated. In China, it was not. It was, in fact, it was really not even talked about until 1989 in Tiananmen Square. I mean, the big victory, Chinese victory, had been the work of the nationalists, certainly more than the communists. And then, so everything that it began to change about a quarter of a century ago. But as far as I know, and Bill Joseph is here, and he can correct me, but there had been a military parade on the anniversary of the revolution, but not on Victory Day. This was new. This was a great show. It was kind of following up on the Beijing Olympics. I don't know what, and competing with Russia and all showing off its military might. There was a lot of it about it that was disappointing to me. I mean, it seems to me that with some 20 million Chinese victims in World War II, more could have been made of that. I mean, yes, there was aggression. There was outrage expressed at Japanese aggression, which is very understandable. But at least in Putin's remarks, there was a minute of silence for the 27 million war dead. She didn't have any minute of silence for all the war dead. And if I'm not mistaken, that at the very military parade in his speech, she announced a troop reduction. So I don't think it's really a sign that China is flexing its muscles militarily in some major aggressive way. But it was a very dramatic political ritual. I don't know whether you want to add to it.
I don't think there'll ever be a military alliance between China and Russia, and the problems with the problems are way too deep, and the suspicion, especially in the Russian Far East, is far too great. But I think it's an alliance of currently it's sort of an alliance of convenience. But I think as soon as China develops a significant Navy presence and begins to really, truly dominate East Asia, I think it'll be a great opportunity for the U.S. and Russia to cooperate, try to contain China's rise. That's the best. That seems to be the most logical. And there's we can talk a little bit after, but there's all kinds of skepticism among the Russian military community in Moscow about any kind of cooperation with China, military technology and the like. So I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just also add that Russia has a very old pattern of when things are tense with the West, as they have been, Russia then turns east. And when things are tense with the East, as they were in Russia after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Russia turned immediately to alignments and alliances with Western European powers, which helped lead to World War I. But so this is a very old-standing pattern. And then whatever it is, a 4,000-kilometer border with China certainly has created frictions for centuries and centuries.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, way in the back. Go ahead.
I guess what I'm asking is, what are Russia's interests in Syria? I feel like the answer is like.
You have to repeat the question.
Oil related at all, with kind of the tension of oil flowing
So to repeat the question, what precisely are Russia's interests in Syria, and does it have to do with oil flowing through Ukraine?
I mean, it's a very good question. And I think that if this was, if any kind of military interventionism in Syria was to put up to a vote in Russia, I very much doubt that the Russian citizenry would support this sort of military adventurism. But I think it's a gambit to gain a foothold under the auspices of battling ISIS, ISIL, and other extremist groups, and also a way to demonstrate again that Russia is doing something about a problem, while the United States is, being passive or not intervening enough. But there's used to be an old Soviet military base there on the Mediterranean, perhaps some kind of an additional foothold in the Mediterranean. But but in terms of internal Syrian politics, it seems like it's the interest. It's hard to make an argument for at least direct military confrontation and direct troop deployments. So.
Other questions? Oh, sorry. Yeah, Gwen.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the declining in oil prices and what that's going to do to bond ratings for Russian debt and, the domino effect that can come from those different prices?
So I mean, yeah. So the question is about the decline in the oil prices and the Russian bond ratings and things like that. So Russia's sovereign debt is there's relatively little of it, and so I think that and the balance sheets are actually pretty healthy overall on the sovereign side. On the private side, things are much worse. But the thing that's always so surprising about the international financial markets is that companies, and especially sovereigns that have been previously bankrupt, seems to be able to come back to the global financial markets pretty easily. Yeah. So I think it really is a matter of just sort of having access and removing these legal permissions on Russia's borrowing abroad. I don't think it will have any kind of significant implications in terms of bond ratings or anything like that. Putin, that was his first, well, not first, but one of the first things he did was to repay all of Russia's debts ahead of schedule, so as to, be able to conduct independent foreign policy, and they've more or less kept to that. Although there's been more sovereign borrowing lately than in the past. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, way in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was mentioned earlier that Serbia, China, and India were all invited to Russia to celebrate, and also that India was mentioned in the speech. I was kind of wondering, what is the factor, what is the current relationship between Russia and India, and what sort of interests does Russia have there?
Did you say?
Yeah, what is the relationship between Russia and India, and what sort of interest does Russia have there in South Asia?
It's not at all my area of expertise, but historically, India and Russia have had a very positive relationship, especially at the onset of Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where the Pakistanis were really involved in fighting off the Soviets on the Taliban side, and that also brought India and then Soviet Union closer together. There's a very deep military cooperation between the two countries. And so they've traditionally has been a great deal of cooperation, but it's also could be because there's not much to fight over. They don't share a border, or there's not too many contradicting interests. But I think that, again, to the question about the potential Russia-China alliance, that would really put strains on that relationship with India, which purchases a lot of Russian military hardware and all of that kind of stuff. So. My sense is that the relationship is strictly around military technology transfers and economic cooperation, but I think the lack of friction in the relationship, just sort of geographically and in terms of their interest, is allowed them to have a pretty which is actually kind of remarkable if you think about it. India has had a great relationship with the United States and a great relationship with Russia at the same time. I don't know how many countries can really say that,
Yeah. Okay, maybe one or two more questions? Or maybe none. Yeah, Luba, go ahead.
Putin has maintained this really remarkable level of popularity, more than I would expect from a country that's dealing with so many economic issues. And I'm wondering, how long can this cult of personality be a band-aid for Russian politics? When will Putin make Russia strong again run out and people actually start, seeing that how Russia is no longer as strong as it was in the beginning of this decade?
Well, I think fairly soon. I hope fairly soon. Everybody had assumed that he's a shoo-in to be reelected in 2018 for another 6 years. If he is reelected, then he will have been in power continuously for 24 years, which is exactly how long Stalin was in power. But it is possible that with this economic downturn, it does sound comical to say, well, the ratings are down to 82%, approval rating, but it's a fairly rapid decline. The people, I just saw some poll figures, the people who are most discontented with Putin, give him the lowest ratings, are the poorest people right now. So it really is that, and poverty is on the rise. So it may be that it'll be a problem. On the other side, who is there to replace him? I mean, there are no live opposition figures. I mean, there was this Navalny who then got put under house arrest, and there just aren't vibrant and vital counter forces. So the other argument is that just by inertia, he would stay, although maybe he'll do another flip-flop and have Medvedev back. In any event, so let's hope that he goes, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
Okay, maybe one last question, sir. Go ahead.
Following on that question, what segments of the Russian hierarchy are in a position to give Putin difficulty? The armed forces, the KGB, heavy industry? Where do you look for an opposition coming from?
Well, maybe we should both answer that. When do you want to answer that first?
Well, Putin's main opposition is the price of a barrel of oil. That's his main source of problems. I agree with you. There's no real opposition. And as a matter of fact, to those of you who are wishing a quick removal of Vladimir Putin out of power, I've been told by people that with direct knowledge of this that there are apparently rooms in Moscow where Putin has been called a traitor to the West by some senior military officials for his policies. This probably maybe 5 to 8 years ago, for his policies of accommodations to the West. So if you look at Russia's popular opinion, if you look at Russia's general attitudes towards the West, in place of a totalitarian, quote-unquote, Putin, a democratically elected leader of Russia could be far more nationalistic and far less reasonable in his dealings with the West. So I would say I would be very careful to who you wish for in terms of Putin's replacement. Now that's a kind of a pessimistic attitude. Just to add on to the public opinion, Kremlin is very, very concerned about Putin's public opinion. They hire the best survey specialists, and they really want to know the real numbers on this. And I don't believe the 82%, because in survey research, depending on how you ask the question, it really matters how people answer, and approve, disapprove ratings, and also in terms of trusting that your opinion is counted and is your phone listened to, and who are your neighbors and all that kind of stuff. So, but I know that within Kremlin, they keep a really good track of his ratings, and his popularity matters a great deal. And I can, if anybody's tremendously interested, I can point them to dissertation-length research on this topic.
Let me just add to that. Let me just say one thing. I agree with you that really it could be somebody worse, but I do disagree that I wouldn't use the word totalitarian to describe Putin, quote unquote, I would say authoritarian, is definitely an authoritarian regime. But yes, there could be somebody worse than Putin, and people are always afraid of that. But of course, there used to be a little liberal, more liberal, somewhat more democratic minority piece of the conversation that's really been very much silenced. So we're just going to have to see. I just want to kind of finish by saying that when I wrote my Russian area studies report last year, I had, in some sense, said that the most important person in Russian area studies last year was Vladimir Putin, because he had taken Crimea and he had invaded Ukraine, and we were all kind of around focusing our attention on this, and that for 2015, the most important person for Russian area studies was Igor Logvinenko, whom we were so happy to have hired and welcoming him. So I just want to really express my appreciation to Igor for coming to Wellesley, for joining our Russian area studies faculty, and also by the political science department. And to thank him especially for his remarks tonight, which were really edifying and very informed. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Okay, thank you all very much for coming. Thanks. Good night.